name is David Kenny. I'm the preacher for the Wadsworth Church of Christ here in Wadsworth, Ohio. In this series of lessons, we've been looking about proofs for the inspiration of the Bible. And particularly this time, we're looking at the accuracy of the historical record. Does the Bible constitute an accurate, unbiased historical account? And that's what we've been looking at, and that's what we're going to continue to look at as some examples from the Old Testament that shows that the Bible is indeed an accurate, historical, and unbiased record. And just to review real quickly, let's take a look at our argument that we're making as it relates to that. It's number one, if it's the case that the Bible is historically accurate and unbiased in every detail, even details that modern history questioned at one time, then the Bible is a historical record beyond peer and authored by one beyond peer, in other words, God. Number two, it is that case that the Bible is historically accurate and unbiased, even revealing details that modern history had questioned at one point. So then number three, the conclusion, therefore, the Bible is the work of a historian beyond peer. And we looked at several examples in the Old Testament and extra-biblical evidence that confirms that what the Bible records is accurate. We looked at several different archaeological discoveries that show that. For example, we talked about the Moabite stone, the Tel Dan Stele, the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III, Sennacherib's prison, in Hezekiah's tunnel. And there's a lot of other examples that we could look at. But today, I want to take a look at what's been deemed as the greatest discovery of the 20th century. And today we're going to talk about something that I actually did a speech on this in high school, and I didn't know how the class was going to respond to it because I didn't go to a parochial school. It was actually just a secular high school. And I didn't know how they were going to respond because the Dead Sea Scrolls are a very religious topic. But it was fascinating. The story of the discovery and the implications of it, the class was very interested in it, and hopefully you will be as well. I actually learned about them in an article that appeared in the Reader's Digest. So that's what we want to talk about today, about the Dead Sea Scrolls. But before we can really do that, just sort of back up a little bit and give you a little bit of a picture of what we're looking at before they were discovered. Take a look at this quote by Frederick Kenyon. It says, "There is indeed no probability that we shall ever find manuscripts of the Hebrew text going back to a period before the formation of the text, which we know as Masoretic." Now, Frederick Kenyon, just to give you an idea who he is, he lived from 1863 to 1952. He's a paleographer, a biblical scholar. He was a classical scholar. He actually worked for the British Museum. He was actually the director of it in 1909. So this person was very well known. He's very scholarly, very highly respected in what he's talking about here. He put a book out called The Ancient Manuscripts, Being a History of the Text and Its Translation, and that quote came from that book. And as the fourth edition of that book was coming out, and this book came out in 1948, as it was rolling off the presses, the Dead Sea Scrolls were being discovered, and it really negated the accuracy of that statement. That statement had held for years. But with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, all that changed. Indeed, what he said probably never would happen, happened. So we're talking about a major find. So let's take a look at, just to give you an idea, at these Masoretic manuscripts here. Now these are the manuscripts that we have currently available to us. These are the ones that we had, we still have them, but prior to the Dead Sea Scrolls discovery, these were our main manuscripts for the Old Testament. And you can notice I put the dates there. The dates are the dates that are believed to have been made. And notice that the Leningrad Codex is the oldest complete codex, and it's the one that serves as a primary basis of our Old Testament. Now there was a time that the Babylonicus Petropontanus, that one up there in AD 1008, the second one listed, it was the oldest, most complete until the Leningrad was found. So you may have sources that say that the Babylonicus was the oldest one. Some of them may say the Leningrad. It just depends on when those two manuscripts, what time that person's writing about. But when we talk about the Masoretic Text, these are the key manuscripts, and we had to ask ourselves how, we need to keep in mind that if you notice those dates, they're fairly recent. I mean, the Bible closed, the Old Testament closed at about 400 BC, and all these dates are well into AD. And that's one of the things that we need to keep in mind. What we have today are copies. We have ancient copies of ancient copies of ancient copies, and these are the latest ones, the latest copies that we have access to. And that's important to remember. And you have to ask yourself, how accurate were the people who made these copies? And that's one of the things that Josephus talks about. Now take a look at this statement here by Josephus, Jews' faithfulness to the text. You know, he was a Jewish historian, and he was writing in response to a lot of attacks made by the Greeks, and one of them was how they treat the scriptures. And this is how Josephus responded to that kind of attack. He said, "We have given practical proof of our reverence for our own holy scriptures, or excuse me, our own scriptures, for although such long ages have now passed, no one has ventured either to add or to remove or to alter a syllable. And it is an instinct with every Jew from the day of his birth to regard them as the decrees of God, to abide by them, and if need be, cheerfully to die for them. Time and again, ere now, the sight has been witnessed of prisoners enduring tortures and death in every form in the theaters, rather than utter a single word against the law and the allied documents." He's talking about the Jewish nation's reverence for the Old Testament. And it's, you know, he's talking about the Masoretic Text. He's talking about the text that would actually be copied again to make up our Old Testament. And he's saying, well, you know, the system they had great reverence for it. Well, it's one thing to say it, but, you know, what did that look like? You know, I mean, we're talking about, you know, before photocopiers, we're talking way before, you know, what we have today, scanners. You know, there was no printing press. We're talking about a time when people had to make these copies by hand. And let's take a look at the Masoretic system. And one of the scholars, matter of fact, this is one of the Old Testament professors I had at Freed-Hardeman University, he wrote this statement about that system of copying. And notice what he says, is these scholars devised an ingenious and elaborate system by which they could check the accuracy of a finished copy. Among other things, they numbered the letters, the words, and verses in a book, counted the occurrence of certain letters in the book, marked the middle letter, the middle word, and the middle verse of each book. According to the Talmud, there were specifications not only for the kind of skins to be used and the size of the columns, but there was even a religious ritual necessary for the scribe to perform before writing the name of God. Rules governed the kind of ink they were to use, the spacing of words, and also forbade their writing anything from memory. And this is the Masoretic system. You know, and it was very important to them and important to us that they made accurate copies, because, you know, they didn't just think that the words of the Bible, the thoughts of the Bible, well, as long as we get it sort of right, you know, we get the general idea, the gist of it. No, that's not the way they looked at it. They looked at every single word, even to the tense, even to the letter, the number of letters in a word. They would count them. And that's important for us to remember. A lot of people say, well, the Bible's inspired, it has a lot of great thoughts in it and all, but that's not what inspiration is talking about. Inspiration is talking about God breathed out the words. He spoke these words to these writers. And that's important that we remember that. And the Jews reverenced that. They went to great lengths to make sure that their copies were completely accurate. And it's important that we know that. And the question is, how do we compare these things? How do we know them? Well, as I mentioned before, we often talk about archaeology, and you might see some programs on archaeology, and we talked about the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark. Well, all that aside, they still don't know where the Ark of the Covenant is. But all those things aside, the movies and the books and all that, the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls is the greatest discovery of the 20th century. It has one of the greatest impacts. And it's something that, 20th century's gone. I know we're in the 21st century. But we need to be reminded of what these scrolls represent and what are the implications. Notice this statement here by one of the respected archaeologists out there. Here's what he says about the discovery. He says, probably the Dead Sea Scrolls have had the greatest biblical impact. They have provided Old Testament manuscripts approximately 1,000 years older than our previous oldest manuscript. The Dead Sea Scrolls have demonstrated that the Old Testament was accurately transmitted during this interval. In addition, they provide a wealth of information on the times leading up to and during the life of Christ. So this is a respected archaeologist telling you that this is the greatest discovery of the 20th century. And it's important that we know that. And as the program unfolds, this will actually be a two-part lesson. We'll talk about the discovery in this lesson, what they found, and then the next lesson we'll take a look at more specifically what was found and what does it mean? What's the implication of that? And hopefully you'll stay tuned when we talk about that as well. But let's move on. Let's take a look at this map here. I'll put the map up, and in the left there, you notice there's a little sub-map there. That sort of shows you several different caves. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found in caves. They were found close to the Dead Sea. There's a community there called the Qumran, and you can see that there in the red arrow. Show you where that's at. There were 11 caves in all. Some of these caves were naturally formed caves. Some of them were man-made caves, depending on where they were at. If they were up high, then the limestone would be very rugged. Some of those caves were there. 1, 2, 3, 6, and 11 are those type. If they were down low, they would be in the sandstone. That would be a softer area, and they could dig out the cave there. That was caves 4, 5, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And they're still debating why these scrolls were put there. The general theory is that the Essenes, that'd be like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they were a little more radical, some people believe. And it's believed that these people went out there and lived in these caves for a while, and they kept their library there. But why did they do that? Well, some people view them as sort of separatists. They wanted to be apart from the Pharisees and the Sadducees and Jerusalem, and they were waiting for the Messiah to come, and they were making those preparations. And so they lived there. And then, when the Romans started to march on Jerusalem, they actually came through and they destroyed this community at about 68 A.D. And then Rome would go on to destroy Jerusalem in 70 A.D. And it's believed that that's probably what happened to this community. The scrolls were just left there. They were fleeing for their lives, probably lost their lives during that altercation with the Roman Empire. But not everybody subscribes to that theory. People are still kicking around different theories. Some people think that possibly these caves were placed there by people in Jerusalem, and people would come there to hide things there just to keep it safe, because there was an uprising between Rome and Israel, and some people were putting materials there in anticipation of that. But generally people think that the Qumran community were Essenes, and that they lived there, and they made those preparations, and then when Rome came through, basically those were left there. And they stayed there for years. Let's take a look at this next one, the Shrine of the Book, the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. And in the center there, in that orange background field, is a clay jar. Now this clay jar is one of the jars where they found these manuscripts. And if you look to the left, that white cap there, that's the outside of the Shrine of the Book. And it's supposed to look like the top of that jar. And then on the other side, if you look at the top of the ceiling there, it has those ridges and everything that sort of goes up in a funnel. That's like you're inside of that jar looking up. And then they have the scroll handle there and the scrolls. And it's all designed around the idea of those scrolls being encased in those jars. And that's really important. That's how they lasted. These things were placed there and then forgotten about. They were forgotten about for years. Matter of fact, in 1947, a young shepherd boy was tending to his goats, and he went up on a hillside to try to get the goats to come back down the hill, and he was just throwing rocks. It's a rocky terrain. I'll show you a picture of it here in a minute. And he threw a rock into the cave, and all of a sudden he heard, he would usually hear the clanging of stones and sand and dirt and whatever, but he heard something clink, and he thought, treasure. That's not sound supposed to be there. So he went to go investigate. And when he investigated, he found these Dead Sea Scrolls. He found some other stuff too, and they went through and they looked for treasure. They couldn't find the treasure, any treasure they were looking for, but they found these old manuscripts. And so they decided to try to sell them. They wanted to make money on them. And as things would go by, it would turn out that eventually people would find out what they had, where it was at, and then archaeologists would go there, but before they got to it, some people had done a lot of damage to them. A lot of people were interested in making a buck and trying to go and grab something and sell it and make money on it, whichever way they want. And a lot of people didn't realize, who went there before, they didn't realize the significant treasure, the Dead Sea Scrolls, were the scrolls. And so a lot of damage was done to them. But we have some very fascinating things that we can learn from them. So let's take a look at what these caves look like. Take a look at this first one here. This is the Qumran Cave number 1. This is the place where the great Isaiah scroll is found. This is the one the young boy found, this particular cave. And this is also an example of a natural cave. This is one that was actually a natural formation. And you can see it's very rocky, it's a very steep terrain. And that boy was throwing stones there, chasing after his goats, and made that discovery. So these caves are, they're not just real apparent to see. I mean, they're easy for us to see now because we're zoomed in on it. But you can imagine if you pull back, it wouldn't take long before this cave would look like a shadow. And that's sort of interesting to see. And then this next one here, cave number 4, that is, it's viewed to be the most productive, meaning they got the most information out of cave 4. Sometimes it's hard to see that between cave 1 and cave 4. But archaeologists say that cave 4 actually had more information that they found beneficial. Matter of fact, they say that 90% of the Dead Sea Scrolls that they were able to recover were found here in cave 4. And this is an example of a man-made cave. And you can sort of see the sedimentary layers there. They would be able to go out and create a cave. They were able to dig into it. It was a soft sandstone. And that's believed what they did. That they created those. So what did they really find? There's a lot of different ways to look at it, and what I did is I created some slides to show you some of the things that they found. These were really focused on things relating to the Bible, and you're going to find that they found a lot of things, a lot of copies of the Bible that were really old. But it wasn't like they found a copy of, they didn't find a copy of the Bible like like this. They found scrolls. They found fragments of different books of the Bible. You've got to keep in mind, the Bible means books. It's 66 books. It's 39 of the Old Testament. So they found individual scrolls or pieces of various books of the Bible there. And so it's really fascinating to see what was found. So let's just go through here and I'll sort of give you a synopsis of what they found in each of these caves. Cave number 1 was the original cave that was discovered. It was officially excavated February 15th to March 9th, 1949. And then look at the list of the things that were discovered. The first thing, probably one of the greatest discoveries, was what they call Isaiah A. They have an Isaiah A and an Isaiah B. Isaiah A is the earliest, most complete copy of the Bible we have, of a book of the Bible. It is the most ancient manuscript that's the complete. That's it, Isaiah number 8. And then they found Isaiah B. It's another copy, but it's incomplete. It went through some damage. They found a commentary of Habakkuk, plus the first few chapters within that commentary. It's a 3-chapter book. They also found fragments of other books of the Bible, and I put them in bold for you here in italics. But they also found other books too. It wasn't just that they had books of the Bible, but they had some apocryphal type books. They had, it was a library, so they had different books for different purposes. But they had a lot of the Old Testament scriptures. But I listed some of the books, some of the manuscripts that they found in addition to that. But that's what they found in Cave 1 by the time archaeologists got to it. And then Cave number 2, this is another cave. This one was ransacked. It was excavated from March 10th to the 29th in 1952. They found some 300 fragments of 33 different manuscripts, and they found several Old Testament books, such as Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Jeremiah, Psalms, Job, and Ruth. And again, these are fragments of those manuscripts. See, the people came in, they ransacked it. They were looking for treasure, looking for gold, precious metal, whatever they were looking for. And so they just sort of tossed any the pottery or any of the manuscripts. They weren't interested in that. And so a lot of damage was done. And unfortunately, some of the damage was done here as well. And then cave number 3, it was excavated in March 1952. It contained fragments of some 14 manuscripts, and they found fragments of Ezekiel, Psalms, and Lamentations in there as well. And then cave number 4, this is called the Partridge Cave. It was also ransacked, but it's still viewed to be the most productive. Remember I said that 90% of the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in this cave. It's believed to be the main library of the Qumran community. And notice that they had Psalms and Isaiah and Nahum and different books. And notice that I put up there, someone had wrote that the order of books by appearance seems to be Deuteronomy, Isaiah, Psalms, and Minor Prophets. Well, Deuteronomy's in fragments all over the place. But it seems like that was something that they were interested in. And some scholars say that they found fragments of every book of the Old Testament, except maybe for Esther at one time. So, and then cave number 5. Cave number 5 was excavated in September of 1952. They found fragments of some 25 manuscripts, and some portions of Deuteronomy and 1 Kings were found here. Cave number 6 was excavated September 27, 1952. It contained fragments of some 31 manuscripts, and they found fragments of various books of the Bible: Genesis, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, 1st and 2nd Kings, Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Solomon, and Daniel. So they found fragments of biblical manuscripts there as well. And then caves 7 through 10, we sort of lump all these together. They were excavated from February 2nd to April 6, 1955. Cave 7 had fewer than 20 fragments, and I just put the number of fragments there that they had in there in parentheses. But they found some, even among this small amount, they found fragments of Exodus and Jeremiah there. Cave 8 had fewer than 5 fragments, but they found fragments relating to Genesis, Psalms, Exodus, and Deuteronomy. Cave 9 had 1 fragment, but they're not exactly sure what it was. No biblical manuscripts there. And cave number 10 had 2 pieces of pottery with writing, but they didn't find any manuscripts there in those caves. And then the last one here, cave number 11, it was excavated February 1956. They found fragments of some 21 different texts. And again, they found texts relating to the Bible: Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Job, Psalms, and Ezekiel. And keep in mind too, there's other books that they found outside of the Old Testament. But this is really what our focus is, so that's really why I sort of honed in on that. And so when we talk about these things, you might think, well, so what? They found some fragments, they found an old scroll, an old copy of the book of Isaiah, so what? I mean, what's the big deal? Well, that's what we're going to talk about next time. It's a fascinating story when you just think about, this boy's out, he's tending his goats, and these Qumran people, they lived somewhere, before the time of Christ, and around that time. And those things were put there and sealed off. I mean, they didn't physically seal them, but they sealed those things in jars, and they just sat there. They were forgotten about until about 1947. And then all of a sudden we find these copies, and that's a very significant find, and we'll talk about that next time. Again, before we close, let's take one more look at our argument that we're making. And it's talking about the historical record. Do we have an accurate historical record of the Bible? Well, you have to take a look at, is the record we have accurate or not? And that's what we're talking about. The Dead Sea Scrolls tells us, shows us, demonstrates to us that the Bible is historically accurate. And the implications we're going to look at our next episode. Some people have been given wrong directions. They've been told things such as faith only, works only, or grace only would save them. Some have attempted to change the terms along the way. Maybe they put baptism before a person could believe, such as they do with infants. Some become confused when reading the directions because they fail to realize where they are on the map, possibly even thinking they're already saved. As a person is traveling in a car and must follow the road map, so we must follow the proper directions to heaven. Notice the directions on our roadmap include believe, and then repent, then confess, and then immersion, which is baptism, and then a person's added to the church by the Lord. Once added to the church, they serve and worship the Lord faithfully all the days of their life, and that will take them to heaven. Where are you on the roadmap to heaven?